kick us off, and then I'll do a brief intro too.
Sure, absolutely. Well, colleagues, good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and it's great to have you guys once again. And of course, a huge big thanks to the colleagues from UNICEF who are joining us for this session. As colleagues know, we usually have two webinars a month, jointly with our DCO colleagues. So this is the joint DGC-DCO webinar. On the beginning of the month, it's usually more of a webinar where we look at upcoming issues. It's more of a planning sort of webinar. And the other webinar that we have during the month is usually a kind of sort of training workshop, peer exchange, which is what we're having now, focus being on advocacy. I just want to say that I think this is an important one, at least from where I'm sitting, because I think for the past years, we have always been talking about the issue of where does communication end and where does advocacy begin? Is there a blurring line there? How is all of this, working? And in that regard, and I'll be very frank with the guest from UNICEF, we have always been talking about UNICEF and saying, UNICEF is the one who seems to have the silver bullet on this. It is the entity that we look upon. So it's really great to have you guys. It's great that we talk about this and see how this is working. I know that Celine has an introduction which is called the art of strategic advocacy. I must say that there's probably I agree, there's an art to it, but I believe there might be a science to it as well. It's probably both an art and a science. So I'm just, look, from where I'm sitting, I'm just really thrilled, to be part of this and to listen in, and I'm really, waiting with bated breath to see, what you guys are going to talk about, show and say. So with that, over to you, Carolina. And once again, thank you very much, UNICEF colleagues.
Thank you so much, Janos, and a warm welcome to everybody. If it's the evening for you or afternoon, or you just started your day, thank you for being with us. And we're also super excited to be here with our UNICEF colleagues. I just wanted to give a little bit of background. So when we sat with all the UN SDG Comms directors to see which were the guidelines that we were going to revamp the UN Sustainable Development Group communications guidelines, which we co-convened along with our DGC colleagues, we weren't really going to revamp this one, the advocacy one, because it was kind of newish. It was from 2017, and that one really had UNICEF played a lead role, right? And UNICEF colleagues were the ones who said, and I'm looking at my dear colleague Natascha here, no, let's revamp it as well. So I'm happy that we did, because then all of them have this post-reform way of working, communicating together, where you perceive in a coherent way, this is what the UN team does, but you actually really clearly see how the different agencies with their different mandates are essential, because the issues need to be approached in a holistic way. So this is how it came to be. And when we did that first webinar to walk you through these guidelines, we said, we're going to skip this PowerPoint where we talk about the advocacy guideline, because we had our dear UNICEF colleagues had already promised us that they would be welcome, that they would be able to come here and do a deep dive instead of this elevator pitch that we would be able to do earlier this year. So this is it. This is us keeping the promise. And again, big thanks to UNICEF colleagues. I'm going to introduce them here to you. We have here Sonia, Chief of Advocacy Capacity Building Initiative for Advocacy Section DGC. And maybe you do, it's Advocacy Section. You call it DGC, but it's UNICEF's DGC, right? For UNICEF, yeah. DGCA, okay, Communications and Advocacy, right? Pavithra, Rangan is also with the UNICEF team. And here you go, you can meet them here. And we also have Emma, right? Emma Fergusson, advocacy specialist also with UNICEF. And we have Natascha, who is our go-to partner for all things related to communications and related to reform and interagency issues. She's super active. We really wanted to thank UNICEF to be so really taking care of this and nurturing this relationship and all the guidelines we work together. a big thanks to Celine, because Celine was also, as you know, along with our DGC colleagues, was also really spearheading this initiative and really putting a lot of effort in all the guidelines, and the same for this session. So you'll hear more from Celine. So without further ado, let me pass the ball to Celine for the intro of the session, and to start walking you through the science and the art and how it most essentially comes together. And we learned it, and after COVID particularly, because and our CC it now, and the UN teams too, because you can invest how you can invest in bringing COVAX vaccines, you can invest in training nurses, but if you don't win hearts and minds, then you don't move the needle on so many issues. So be it gender-based violence or other key issues that are very dear for your UN country teams on the ground. So over to you, Celine.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you so much to colleagues at UNICEF to be with us and to organize this session on the arts and the science of strategic advocacy. So as Carolina mentioned, when we put all those guidelines together and we revamp them, we really want to emphasize that the resolution on repositioning the UN system really called for a greater communication and advocacy and a stronger commitment to effectiveness and efficiencies. So as we have this new generation of UNCT, we also need a new generation of UNCG. So we mentioned communicating in a coherent way, powerful, non-silent ways. And what we also know is communication and advocacy is not only a means to promote results and impact, but it also has to contribute to achieving some results. So it's very important, and we're going to the second slide. So it's very important that UNCGs are supporting the implementation of the cooperation framework and its outcomes. We really know that, and that's something we really emphasize during in those new guidelines. It's the really strategic role of communicators during the whole programming cycle. So from the CCA, the Common Country Analysis, through the cooperation framework, and also the results reporting, we really need to have the communication at the table and to engage since the start of the process. So for instance, the CCA, we can really get all the fundings and use them for your advocacy strategy initiative. It's very important. And also to start dialoguing with the different partners and stakeholders that are part and at the table when you develop your CCA. So it's very crucial to have communicators really supporting the implementation of the cooperation framework. So this guideline that we revamped, it was the last one. The previous version was from 2017, and it really called for a coordinated joint actions around advocacy. It's really about working together, not in a silos way, having a more strategic joint advocacy to promote the SDG and also the 2030 agenda. So working together to create some opportunity for increased collaboration with donors, with government, with the private sectors, the civil society. It's a very all engaging, all society approach that we're really trying to promote. We know that working together is also being stronger together. It also shows how we can best leverage existing capacity by amplifying the power of each agency in their specific mandate, and also building on each other comparative advantage. So there is different type of advocacy. You can start individually and then work together after in some more coherent approach initiative. You can also, it's very important when you have an advocacy to have some clear responsibilities, define the resources, and also really to engage with different constituencies. Next one, thank you. So thank you so much for colleagues who have responded to the survey. And what it shows, the result is that 48% of colleagues have not developed an advocacy strategy that's separated from the COM strategy. So what we see also when we discuss with colleagues, it's some of them have carried some initiatives, some actions that related to advocacy, but don't especially have more strategy in place. So that's something we discuss also and see how we can better take this into account. The focus really for colleagues was 42% to have advocacy to enable, to have a better enabling environment, but also to really focus on public policy integrations. There were like 4 top priorities areas: youth participation, gender equality, women empowerment, and climate change, as well as GBV. So those are very like the area, the topics that are the most concern and interest from colleagues. And then they want to hear more about the advocacy tactics, like what are the messaging, the channels, the targets, how we can develop clear, measurable outcomes, and also what do we do really to have like a real engagement with stakeholders? How do you map your evidence and so on? So colleagues from UNICEF will definitely go over all those expectations, and you're willing to ask questions after. Next, please. So the focus and the objective of this session, it's really to make sure that we have the same understanding of the strategic and integrated advocacy, to introduce really some like key concepts and really understand like what is advocacy, what is not, and also to have a peer-to-peer exchange. So it will be divided in really 2 sessions. The first one will be really like on the concept, and then after we'll hear from colleagues from UNICEF, Emma, from Danilo, who is the colleagues in Costa Rica, CEO, and also from Masimba, the UNIC director in South Africa. So over to colleagues at UNICEF, Sonia and Pavithra for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine, and thanks to the UN colleagues for having us and giving us this opportunity to talk about advocacy. I think we will try to get a little bit more into the science of developing an advocacy strategy, but also to say that this half hour is only going to be a very basic overview, because we typically have day-long workshops to go over like part of this advocacy strategy development. So we are happy to share with you additional resources afterwards that can guide you to more tools that will help in your advocacy work. As most half of you indicated that you don't actually have a strategy specific to advocacy, but most of you are already doing this work in your day-to-day lives. But what we're trying to give you is more tools and resources to be more deliberate and systematize your efforts around the strategy. So I'll just read you the definition of advocacy that we use and in our advocacy toolkit, which we'll share with you as well after the webinar. It's the deliberate process based on demonstrated evidence to directly and indirectly influence decision makers, stakeholders, and relevant audiences to support and implement actions that contribute to the fulfillment, in our case, of children and women's rights. You can fill it in for your audiences. So the strategic integrated advocacy, we seek to deliver smart outcomes, and they are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And Pavithra will later on talk about walk you through the process of producing an integrated advocacy strategy. Without this time investment in the strategy development part, our efforts will remain piecemeal and it will unlikely to succeed. So we need also this laser sharp focus on what we want to change to be able to influence decision makers. Next slide, please. So advocacy is related to, but is not the same thing as some of these other areas. Campaigning, for instance, or public mobilization, as some call, is one advocacy tactic, but there are many others, such as political influencing, coalition building. Communication plays a critical role in advocacy strategies, but never a standalone tactic. It also supports other objectives like brand building, fundraising, etc. And the public narrative, a compelling public narrative, is essential for our advocacy efforts, but a narrative on its own is not sufficient. Strategic advocacy requires a clear theory of change, which we'll get into later. Resource mobilization is one area. Fundraising for our programs is not advocacy, it's fundraising. And we can advocate, though, to influence aid policies, for instance, and how donors allocate funding, such as some of the work that we've done around nutrition and COVAX and whatnot. And technical assistance is about supporting government's capacities, and advocacy is about influencing decision makers and building the political will for action. Next slide, please. So strategy versus tactics. Strategies provide the answers to the what, why, who, and how questions, and the what is the desired outcome for children, the why do we have to address this issue? So an analysis of the problem and its impact. The who is who are the stakeholders, especially those who can make decisions that will help us achieve our advocacy outcome. And the last but not least is the how, and a lot of the tactics language will come to that, are the approaches we'll take to influence decision makers, and what are the tactics that we employ. They are equally important, both parts of an advocacy strategy. Next slide, please. And we often use this quote attributed to Sun Tzu, that strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, whereas tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So I'll pass it over to Pavithra to walk you through some of the steps.
Thanks, Sonia. And thanks again, colleagues, for having us here. And taking off from where Sonia left us to say, how do we define advocacy? Just wanted to say that we all in the room, as we discuss, do advocacy. It's almost done intuitively by so many of us in UNICEF too. No pressure at all that you think UNICEF is the go-to place to do advocacy, to hear more about advocacy, but just to say that in UNICEF too, with our country offices, all of us, what we're essentially trying to do is build a method to how to do advocacy. So we all do it intuitively. It's almost a skill that we're born with. In fact, it's if advocacy is influencing, it's something that we, from when we're children, almost like whether we form coalitions with our siblings to get our parents to do what we want them to do, or taking if we want something from elders in the house, we choose a route, whether we ask our grandparents or we ask somebody else. We're constantly negotiating and finding ways to get what we want, and we're trying to figure out who has the power to give us what we want. And we're doing this all the time. So we do this in our jobs as well. And what we're trying to do in today's session is really just lay out methodically, is there a way in which, as Sonia mentioned in the definition, deliberately think about advocacy. While we get into a meeting with the minister and we use that opportunity, can we beforehand spend a lot of time thinking about exactly what is it that we want to achieve, and thereby figure out the different steps to get there, so that we're not constantly winging it, in a way, for the lack of better words. So essentially to say, we're here going to be talking about those different steps in creating an advocacy strategy, which we all do, but this is just going to lay out the method. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about whether it's an art or a science, and we're using these words, but just want to say that we call it the art of advocacy strategy simply because there is a method. So in that way, it is something, you could say it is scientific, but it is more an art because so much of advocacy is dependent on the external atmosphere that you're working in. And so much of it you don't have control over. You are making an informed, best estimated guess as to what will get you there. But you can't say, I'm going to do this, and therefore it's going to get me here. You don't know this. You're hoping it will. You're making the most strategic guess to get there. You're going through a method to get you there. But will we definitely get there in the ways we hope to in that time? Well, we don't know. If we do, we're lucky. That's why advocacy is a really long game. It takes a lot of time, and it's really deliberate. And the critical way to think about advocacy, which might be useful for us to say, is what are we doing to influence somebody externally not within our own organization, not amongst ourselves, but decision makers externally to do something that they wouldn't do if we didn't influence them. That's what we're trying to do when we're trying to say what is advocacy. We're trying to influence someone with the power to do something that they wouldn't do if we didn't act. It's not just that we're advocating because, oh, they just don't know. If we tell them, they'll do it. Often in the world, we know that's not the case. It's not because they don't know that they're not doing, but there's several obstacles along the way to that stop us from getting where we want to. So in developing an advocacy strategy, we're trying to systematically try and get rid of the barriers to influencing and take advantage of the opportunities that exist along the way. So with that, can you move on to the next slide? So this is just a quick, we call this an advocacy strategy canvas. And essentially why we're showing you this is to say that we don't need like sort of 10, 20 pages of an advocacy strategy written out to actually have a really concrete step-by-step process or a strategic method to influencing. What it does require is several different pieces that need to come together, and this canvas shows an overview of those different pieces that are essential for development of an advocacy strategy. So like Sonia mentioned, we develop this advocacy strategy in our workshops, which we, as the Advocacy Capacity Building Initiative in UNICEF, do over a period of 4 days. We take this time to, sit and identify how do you develop an outcome, how do you address who your targets are, how do you do a power map. We go through this process over 4 full days. What we're trying to do today is really just give you an overview within an hour. We probably have 20 minutes for this presentation with some questions. So please excuse us if we're not going to be getting into the details of this. We'd be very happy to have another opportunity to get into those, but just setting expectations straight that we're only going to be sort of talking through what those different steps look like right now. So we start off with trying to identify really what area we want to advocate with, and it was nice to see in the survey the priorities that as a communications group you all have identified. So broadly, we start off with a broad thematic area we want to focus on, and then we go into developing what the impact that we want to create is, a broad advocacy impact. From there, we narrow it down to the SMART outcome, really specific outcome. And then once we have the outcome, that is what is it that we specifically want to achieve, which is measurable, we use that as a foundation to then identify who our targets are, who our stakeholders are, what the barriers to influencing are, what the opportunities that lie in the way are. And then what are the tactics? Like Sonia mentioned, these are we have a tendency, all of us often, to get into tactics first before thinking of the whole step, right? Like tactics are just, we jump into activities. Oh, can we organize a press conference? Can we bring together young people? Can we do this? And we're really good at thinking of those multiple activities, but it's so important that we really drill down on the what. What is that specific change that we want a decision maker to achieve that they wouldn't do if we didn't influence them? And then your tactics are only taking advantage of the opportunities, trying to work around the barriers to achieve this outcome. So with that, just if we can move on to the next slide, please. What do we need for developing a successful strategy, but also for implementing it effectively, right? One is really prioritization. And this is why in UNICEF as well, we consistently try to work with senior leadership as much as possible to say, as an office, we need to know what our priorities are. And this is similar for interagency advocacy, to be really clear on what we're prioritizing, which always means dropping out things that we can't focus on. You can't do everything. We really have to be very clear on what is it that we want to do. It doesn't mean other things are not important. It just means we are prioritizing now based on what opportunities are available, where there's momentum for success, based on where our comparative advantage is, where we can make the biggest inroads. We need to prioritize. So because advocacy is a very long game and it takes a lot of people, not just comms people, a lot of resources, human, financial, to actually get there. And we don't have unlimited resources, so we need to prioritize. Two is the collaboration and integration piece. Often this is It's interesting, right? There's always this tension between what is communication, what is advocacy, is it the same thing? And our comms colleagues responsible for advocacy, our program colleagues responsible for advocacy. We truly think that we need the whole office and the expertise of program colleagues as well as comms colleagues, monitoring and evaluation colleagues, research colleagues. Advocacy is a whole office collaborated, integrated effort. It is not the job of one person, one team. We cannot do successful advocacy if we don't have the expertise collectively into the development of a strategy. And you'll see, as we just showed you, and I'll talk us through some of this, but really knowing what that change is, exactly how much money are we asking for, that will come from a research team. Where does that money need to be spent? That will come from our program colleagues. The tactics will potentially come more from the comms and advocacy colleagues. An analysis of barriers, opportunities will come from everyone who's interacting with those decision makers. So we need all of that expertise. So it is collaborative. And while saying that, it's then so important to have specific roles and responsibilities and accountability for the development of strategy and its implementation. So who will be responsible for strategy development? Who will be accountable for monitoring progress consistently? Who is going to be responsible for implementing each activity? A big part of the strategy development process is also laying out those roles and responsibilities and accountabilities for success. And last and not the least is really support from leadership. This is obviously for us as country offices, as a headquarter office, but also as agencies, really having leadership put the weight behind those priorities and saying, yes, this is what we're going to speak at every big important event. This is going to be the one thing we're going to focus on. This is where we're going to give most attention to. So with that, over to the next slide, please. Now, it was interesting to know that you all had specified development of smart outcomes as one of the expectations from the workshop. We'll go over it somewhat in a little bit of a detail, not too much, but essentially to say we know this and just defining it is helpful sometimes in trying to understand how different an impact is from an outcome. When we say advocacy impact, what we're meaning is really a broad long-term objective or a goal, which is long-term, which gives us a broad sense of a direction as to where we are headed. But this impact itself is not, it doesn't give you much information. It needs an accompanying strategy to tell us how we'll get to that impact. So it requires that roadmap. When we say outcome, this is really, and I can't stress enough how this is the most important part of your advocacy strategy. We need to know what is the specific change we want to achieve. How can we measure that change? And in what time period is it realistic to achieve that change? And are we able to communicate this change to our audiences, to our decision makers? What is that change we want to achieve? How measurable it is? So if we can move on to the next slide, please. That's why we call it a smart outcome. Sonia mentioned this: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time bound. It's good to think of your outcome having these components. On to the next slide, please. This example is a useful way to sort of think of why we consistently saying it needs to be specific and measurable. So an advocacy impact could look like we want to secure a sustainable reduction in the number of dying children. So we know this is a broad goal. It's giving us a direction. We know that primary health care is what we're broadly trying to focus on, ending preventable child deaths. When we're talking about the outcome, we're saying, how are we going to prevent these child deaths? Right? We're getting more specific. Typically, we think of it as, we'll ensure investment in primary healthcare. This will ensure, that preventable deaths are, that we're able to prevent children that can die from preventable causes. So moving from that, we want to really get specific. We want to say who will enable this investment, by when, how much investment, from what percent to what percent, focusing on what areas of primary healthcare, and by when, right? So we really want to get that specific. Who is going to invest? How much? By when? In what? To benefit whom? So really trying to, and this will make sure that it's measurable, right? You can see that we're saying, have we achieved this? Have we achieved, has the parliament approved the budget? Has it been approved by this percent to this percent? What is the bill saying it will try to achieve? Is the focus on these areas of primary health, primary healthcare, for instance? On to the next. So here, this is trying to, what we're trying to do here is to say, when we're developing advocacy outcomes, right? These outcomes or objectives we're trying to define. Often in our experience, when we run these workshops with country offices, colleagues are saying, oh, we want to, through advocacy, achieve behavior change, or we want to ensure service delivery, improve service delivery, or we want to generate evidence. But we really want, so we want to say how is an advocacy outcome different from this kind of an outcome, right? Because we said that it is influencing someone to do something that they wouldn't do. So if you go to the example of how we of how this looks. So for instance, when we say improve service delivery, that is something that we want to, how is the service delivery going to be improved, right? That's a program outcome. So how can we influence the government to improve service delivery? One way of doing it could be, can we enable policy change? Can we ask for greater investments? The how to improving that service delivery is the advocacy outcome. So for instance, providing technical support, like Sonia mentioned, it's often a great tactic. Or in one side, it is part of our work. As organizations, we provide technical support to the government. But then again, it can also be a tactic to win the government or decision makers trust before we can get to actually getting them to invest in a policy or making investments into a particular program. So really trying, and the advocacy here would look like shifting decision makers' attitudes, perceptions. What are they talking in public now about a particular issue? Can we shift that narrative? Can we get them to talk about it in the ways in which we believe our evidence points us to talk about? I don't want to get into each of these details, but essentially to say that changing public behavior is more a comms C4D sort of function. An advocacy sort of outcome could look like really, what is the public debate on this issue currently? What is this? Are we listening to social media and saying what's that debate? What are we doing to change that, for instance? So if you move on to the next slide, just reiterating the importance of an outcome. Before getting into the whole strategy or the tactics, this quote by Lincoln just says that if I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first hour sharpening the axe. Having a specific outcome is really your first hour sharpening the axe. Once you have that, you can really think about the different steps as to who has the power, why are they not doing it, etc. If we move on to the next slide. Now, once we have that outcome of who does what, by when, to what end, we want to use this outcome to then identify who the different stakeholders who are critical to our advocacy journey are. So here the stakeholders are divided into like 4 broad categories. We look at them as, so your advocacy target will be that person in power, the final top person in power who has the power to make you achieve your outcome. Advocacy influencers, for instance, will be people who are close to the target, who can influence the target to get them to where they are. So it can look very different in each case. It could be goodwill ambassadors somewhere. It could be really influential religious leaders somewhere. It could be advisors to the ministers in some places. It could be the first lady in some places, depending on your circumstance. Allies and partners, and by this we collectively do this all the time. We're forming alliances with civil society partners, with UN agencies, with other organizations, very, very critical for advocacy. And one stakeholder that be useful for us to watch is our opponents, who we often don't try. It's not our instinct to go to think of who our opponents are, but it's good to know in a crowding space of a crowding market with limited attention, who is opposing us actively, but also who has competing agendas that therefore then crowd out the market for us to put out our agenda. It's good to think of that as well. If you move on, and with all of these stakeholders in place, how do we know where to invest our resources, which are limited, right? So this is where we do a power mapping. It becomes useful for us to look at who has the power and how interested are they. So once you place all of these different stakeholders on this map, and it's a fun exercise to do, maybe we can get to do it someday, but essentially if we map those stakeholders, we get to know who is for instance, really powerful and opposed to our agenda. So we know how much resource we want to invest there because we want to get them to a supportive space, right? Because they have the power to do this. We probably don't want to invest really bother about the people who are weak and opposed. I mean, because we have stronger players to focus our resources on. So essentially, a power map helps you understand where you want to invest, with whom you want to invest. We move on to the next slide, please. Again, when we're talking about our target, essentially, why are we doing this whole thing? Is because we want to understand what does this person in power or the influencers currently think about the issue and believe about this issue, and what do we want to change that to that belief system to? What are they doing now about this issue? What do we want them to do? This is essentially what we are trying to map, and that's why we are undergoing this whole process. If we move on to the next slide. This is not going to tell you anything, but it also tells you a lot, because what we are saying here is, when you're looking at your target, and if you want to think about influencing them, there can be a gazillion routes to influencing, but those routes open up the more you know about this person. Where do they go to get a haircut on a Sunday morning? Who are they listening to on radio? Who are they? What moves them? Which movie are they seeing and crying? Which celebrities do they hold in high value or respect? Like who are they trying to impress and please? And whose approval do they care about? So we want to tap all those routes. Really, basically, you're being like a spy on this person almost in a way, and trying to think of what is their weakest spot, like really go after their vulnerabilities. It sounds cruel, but essentially you want to get them to do what you want them to do. So your chances of success higher if you just know more about them. If we move on to the next slide. This is all of our favorite part of a strategy, which is tactics, which as comms and advocacy colleagues, we know this, we do this, we're really skilled at using so many of these tactics. This is not even, I'm not even scratching the surface of what these advocacy tactics are. There's so many more, but broadly, we fall back on sort of traditional media, social media, mobilizing the public, coalition building, generating evidence, quiet diplomacy, lobbying. These are all different advocacy tactics. The more you know your target, the more you know your influencer, you want to, what I'm not even covering here and not going to talk to is really barriers and opportunities, to say, what does this person believe? What are your barriers? Based on the barriers, we will decide what those tactics that address those barriers are. And based on opportunities to advocacy, we'll decide what tactics help us leverage those opportunities. So this is just to say there are many tactics, and the more information we have, we'll know which to use and when. If we move on to the next slide. This is just a way we do this session. Also, it's an interesting session where we say, how do you prioritize tactics? Right now, you have all of these tactics. And we broadly group them into 3 criteria that are useful to think about advocacy prioritization. One, looking at the context in which you're operating, country context, operating environment, helps you determine what those tactics could be. Looking at your, again, like I said, your target audience, seeing what those barriers are, their beliefs are, etc., is a useful criteria. And then looking at what our risk appetite is as an organization, but also where our strengths are. So for instance, if you have a really strong comms team, you probably want to invest in tactics that are more public facing. If you have a strong team that has like strong relationships with the government, you probably want to fall back on quiet diplomacy or lobbying is one of your tactics. So really multiple routes to choose what your tactics are. And this is why I say it's not a science. It's more an art, because you can try, you can use a tactic and then you can fail and then you can try something else. And then if this tactic works with someone else, or probably something else works with someone else. Just you're going to try, and if you're successful the first time, it's great. If you're not, there's no reason to think you won't be using some other tactic. So it's fun. It's a fun exercise. We can move on, please. The last part, and I'm sorry I've spoken a lot, but we're coming to the end of this presentation, is the advocacy theory of change. And what exactly is the theory of change, right? All of these steps that we've discussed so far, it's the bridge. It's saying, okay, this is what we want to achieve. How do we get to the other end of the bridge? What are those different steps? It's putting all of that together. So if you move on to the next slide. This is a template. We have templates for each of those different parts to help us, and we'll be happy to share these tools with you after. But essentially, to say what are the different activities, tactics that we will pursue? Because what is it, the insight about our key target that we identified, right? What is their belief or behavior? I showed you the tactics to the target tool that we use. Because this will, what are the barriers and opportunities that it's taking advantage of and trying to move out of the way so that our outcome is achieved. So essentially, a theory of change is putting together in a very succinct way your full strategy that you've tried to analyze. So that's a theory of change. And with that, you have a broad outline of a strategy. I will now tell you what we don't have. After we've done all this, we can move on to the next slide. This is just an example. We don't have the time, so I'm not going to go into it, but we'll share the deck. You can see what that example looks like. If you move on. So here again, all strategy is choice. We have to choose one route. That one route is only ever going to be your best guess. And thus it's strategic because you're bringing in all the knowledge that is useful on that subject, all the expertise that we have as a group collectively, bring that together and saying, okay, with all of this information, this is the route I want to take, which is possibly going to get me to success. If I don't get there using this route, I can always change the different blocks on the way. And which is why it's so important to constantly revisit our strategy and not look at any of these parts of a strategy as set in stone, because they're constantly moving depending on your external environment, internal factors, all sorts of. If we move on to the next slide. This is the most exciting part, to break everyone's bubble and say, okay, now you've done all this work, but there's so much more to do. Which is really, you've just started, which you can keep clicking, please. Yeah. So all that. So once you have the strategy, you need an action plan. You need to know what exactly do you need to do as an office to start implementing the strategy. Do you need an advocacy committee? Do you need monitoring indicators? Do you need funding? What do you need? Do you need a new coalition? What's the action plan? Key messages. You all asked for how to develop key messages. That's a whole 3-hour exercise, so I couldn't go into that. I'm sorry, but developing key messages. But you need your strategy, the what and the how before you even think about your messages, because your messages need to be tailored to every single stakeholder. It's not we have 10 messages that we can use everywhere. You need to know all your stakeholders and then alter your messages to how you sort of reach their heart, soul, mind in every way. How do you impact each of those areas? And then the most interesting part really, which we sort of shy away from, is the monitoring evaluation part, but really such a crucial part of our advocacy strategy. It's clearly identifying our outputs to say, okay, if we said this is the outcome, if we want greater investment in primary healthcare, what are our different outputs? It is maybe having a policy brief released based on evidence, submitting that policy brief to the minister organizing a meeting. These are all different steps to get to that outcome. So to map these outputs and see if you're able to achieve those outputs using the tactics that you are, is really the only way where you'll be able to alter your strategy. So you need those outputs and you need to measure and you need to keep revisiting your strategy. And then, of course, risk and mitigation analysis. I think as UN organizations, it's important for us to think of, we always say we want to be bold. It is our mandate to advocate on several issues, but important to think of what's risky and not. And therefore, what are we going to say and how bold can we be? And then resources and the assumptions we're making. It's always important to map those before we start out, because we are making assumptions. So good to know what assumptions have actually materialized, what is not, what we assume is false, and then alter based on that. On to the next slide, please. So that's why advocacy is an act of faith. But there's so many variables. With that, sorry for talking too much and too long, but open for Q&A.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pavithra. In fact, so either we do a little bit of a Q&A or we jump into the, just because of the time,
Yeah.
could we jump into the panel?
Sure.
And then we have a really interesting panel. Celine, why don't you do the honors and introduce the panel? And then we'll ask Natascha to moderate the session. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Carolina. So we do have Emma coming from UNFPA, coming from UNICEF, sorry.
Because she's from UNFPA.
And there's a little bit more.
Most the Freudian slip, that's why.
But I will give the floor to Natascha.
Thanks very much, Celine. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Great to see so many people tuning in. So today I have the privilege of introducing three panel members. One of them in the room with us and two online, who will actually be sharing some concrete examples of what advocacy looks like after we've heard this great presentation on the theory and how to develop an advocacy strategy. So our first panelist today is Emma Fergusson, and Emma Fergusson is a mental health advocacy specialist who co-leads the UNICEF's global advocacy agenda and strategy on mental health. And Emma, today you'll be talking to us about a joint venture with WHO. So UNICEF and WHO rolled out the joint advocacy strategy on mental health in schools, particularly important as an outcome also of the pandemic. So over to you, Emma.
Great. And I'm just going to set myself a little timer. I know we are running a little bit over. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you. And I feel like every time I hear that presentation, Pavithra, I write down more things that I need to be doing in my job. And just to really reiterate the importance of going back to your strategy, constantly as things emerge and change. As Natascha said, so I co-lead our global advocacy priority on mental health. Important to note that at the global level, we co-lead these priorities with our program colleagues and in our division of global communications and advocacy. But we work really closely across all of our teams at headquarters and then with regions and country offices as well. The global advocacy priority on mental health has 4 areas of action that I won't go into a huge amount of detail on, but loosely they are investment, parent and caregiver, mental health and support, mental health in schools, and then changing the conversation, tackling stigma around mental health. So today I'm going to talk about that third accelerator, which is around mental health in schools. And just quickly to say, at the global level, it's quite hard to set really smart outcomes on these areas, but we've tried. And our smart outcome is that by 2025, 25 governments will have committed to preventive, promotive and responsive mental health in schools policies. Mm-hmm. This is also kind of replicated in UNICEF's strategic plan on mental health. And so we are kind of fully integrated across our program and our advocacy sections to achieve this goal. When we did our theory of change and our kind of strategic thinking around this area, we identified that the kind of a lack of clear evidence on what needed to be done and a lack of kind of political will on this issue was holding back progress related to mental health in schools. And therefore that kind of informed a number of our tactics and thinking around what we would do to try and change that at the global level. So the example I'm going to briefly talk through is a piece of joint advocacy work with WHO and also UNESCO that we've started at the UN General Assembly just gone in September and will be continuing in the years to come. So really we kind of to fill that kind of evidence gap, what we did with UNESCO and WHO is this is what we call an output. So we've developed this policy guidance, which really sets out clear, actionable steps that governments can take when thinking about a mental health in schools policy. And the policy note sort of breaks down 5 pillars of action that we would want all governments to take. And then we identified the Transforming Education Summit as a key influencing opportunity, really where many of our key kind of international stakeholders would be in New York, and really an opportunity for us to raise this on the agenda in a way that it has never been discussed at the UN General Assembly previously. So we held a relatively high level event with senior leadership from all three agencies. We also co-hosted the event with the government of Thailand, and we had the Queen of Spain as a kind of advocate on this issue in the room. And I would say really don't underestimate the importance of a royal or a senior figure, a goodwill ambassador figure in getting people into a room. And we want people in the room to hear what we have to say. So I think really for us, this is not the end of this approach, but it's as an output, it's a really key kind of step on our journey of how do we start to influence governments. So I would say I'll come on to a little bit with like the successes and learnings from working with other agencies. But what we now plan to use this policy note and the kind of the momentum and the awareness that we built through this event is to break down these 5 pillars in this note into very implementable kind of guidance. So looking at ways that we can pull in evidence on, so one of the pillars in the policy note is around teacher well-being. So using our kind of network of offices all around the world from the 3 agencies, which country is doing this particularly well, and where can we build a body of evidence and case studies that we can take to other governments and say, this is what's working, this is roughly what it's going to cost, and here's how we can help you as these 3 agencies working together. So there are a number of milestones we're looking towards in the coming years. Coming up in 2023, in the spring, we will be launching some cost-benefit analysis on mental health in schools programming, and then looking at other key moments throughout the year where we can link the issue of mental health and education into global events and forums, but then also tapping into regional and national level advocacy opportunities. I'm kind of short on time. I would just say kind of the strengths of working in this way at a global level. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the kind of interagency approach is, I think, really harnessing each organizational's kind of technical capacity. So working with UNESCO, with WHO, UNICEF, we all bring kind of different but very complementary kind of specialisms and technical skill sets, but also relationships. So really tapping into our relationships with ministers, with permanent missions here in New York, to make sure that the room was full with the right people, and that we are following up now with the relevant ministries across health, across education, and across other important ministries that play a role in implementing this policy. And I think having a policy note endorsed by 3 agencies, when we go now to governments, we can clearly say, this is a succinct but pretty comprehensive guide that has the backing of kind of important UN agencies. And I think really has helped us build that consensus at a global level, and has meant that we are being referred to as kind of a go-to coalition or group of organizations on this issue. And I think weaknesses, or rather challenges, just to really quickly come onto that, obviously we're all big bureaucratic organizations, so I think working together is a real strength, but we need to be mindful that when we work together, we can be slightly less nimble than we perhaps would otherwise. And we just need to make sure that we're kind of being able to present as clear and kind of succinct guidance as we would want to be able to. I'll stop there, and very happy to take questions in the next section.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma. That was a very interesting example. I think what you've managed to highlight is really how to build a very clear advocacy strategy. We heard about clear goals, working with influencers, building networks, evidence-based also advocacy. So a great example, and it'd be very interesting to hear also in the next couple of months and years how that rolls out. Next up, we have Masimba. Masimba, who's speaking to us from Pretoria in South Africa, where he heads up the UNIC office there. And Masimba is going to share with us an experience of how he engaged with different stakeholders to support advocacy efforts for youth and gender equality. But not this specific example comes when Masimba was based in Sierra Leone. namely working in Sierra Leone with the mission there and involved in a demobilization and resettlement program working with young child soldiers. And so please, Masimba, great to hear from you how you managed to maneuver through the political landscape and manage internal challenges as well as implementing the project, which involved, I understand, thousands of ex-combatants. Over to you, Simba.
Thank you very much, Natascha, and good morning, Janos and Carolina. Good day, colleagues. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my fellow panelists, Emma and Danilo, for joining us today. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to today's panel discussion. As Natascha has explained, I've been asked to talk on the topic, how have you maneuvered the political landscape and internal challenges to advance your advocacy work in relation to youth and gender equality? In response to this question, I would like to share with you a brief example from my practical experience from the strategic communications and advocacy work we did in post-conflict Sierra Leone in support of its disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program, and of course, the peace process. You might be wondering why I should be talking about the DDR program, but well, there are still conflicts in Africa and elsewhere. For example, in Ethiopia, in DRC, South Sudan, and in West Africa. And of course, with the major one being the war in Ukraine. In these countries, eventually, guns will be silenced and the task of rebuilding will start. And that's where DDR will become key to the peace process. Our mandate in Sierra Leone was to communicate to the public the peace process through mass information campaigns on DDR. Among those to be demobilized were child soldiers, both girls and boys. Our work included sensitizing communities about the need to accept combatants back into communities and to support the rehabilitation of schools and infrastructure. The reintegration of demobilized children focused on education. After going through a demobilization process, children were either reunited with their families or put into foster care. NGOs then helped the children to enroll in schools, and the older youth enrolled in apprenticeships. For children who had their education interrupted by the war, they could attend transitional education programs that prepared them to enter into the formal school system. Schools that enrolled in child ex-combatants had the choice of receiving educational and recreational materials or teachers. An important feature of DDR was the use of information campaigns to publicize the details of the peace agreements, as well as to raise awareness among the rank and file of the rebel groups. And so, what was the impact? Well, out of over 75,000 combatants who were disarmed and demobilized, over 6,800 of them were child soldiers, and of these, more than 500 were girls. Female soldiers, those adult female soldiers, totaled more than 4,600. The majority of the child soldiers were reunited with their families, and that was a big achievement in and of itself. The rest were absorbed in community educational programs run by UNICEF, our colleagues from UNICEF. And as a result of these arrangements, Sierra Leone's model of demobilizing and reintegrating child soldiers is today considered as a success that could be applied to other peacekeeping operations. What did we do as part of our strategic communications and advocacy work? At the height of our communication strategy, was Radio UNAMSIL, which was broadcasting 24/7 on FM and shortwave programming, and doing so in local languages targeting specific groups, particularly ex-combatants, including child soldiers. We invited child soldiers and other ex-combatants to host talk shows and to share their experiences. Radio coverage included all core UNAMSRO components, together with UN radio news and current affairs and activities of UN agencies and partners, as well as civic education and public service programs. We used the radio for family tracing programs for child ex-combatants and provided them with airtime, particularly to UN agencies. Another important element of our strategic communications and advocacy campaign was the use of performances by local theater groups and musicians for ex-combatants, which focused primarily on promoting not just the DDR component part of it, but also the truth and reconciliation process. We utilized local influencers, such as comedians, artists, and arranged generous airtime on national TV for public outreach campaigns. We didn't have social media then, unlike today, so we relied heavily on traditional means of communications and advocacy. We produced printed products to enhance communication with the local population, including leaflets, press releases, news bulletins, and a newsletter. We conducted sensitization meetings on the ground with local communities, including youth groups and women's organizations. We organized huge, successful public events. For example, we organized a nationwide Women's March for Peace and the first musical concert in more than a decade, featuring one of Sierra Leone's most popular pop stars. And of course, the impact is that today Sierra Leone is considered a model for successful peacekeeping, as well as a prototype for UN's emphasis on peace building. Now, how did we maneuver, if you like, navigate the political landscape or internal challenges as we advocated for the rights of youth and gender equality? To answer this question, I will share with you a few observations or lessons learned, if you like. First, everything is political, as the cliche goes. So every campaign we launched, every event we organized, every visit we made to holding centers of refugee camps, we had to consult with local community leaders or politicians or the government if it's a nationwide campaign. In some countries, traditional leaders and chiefs are very powerful and highly respected. Nothing happens in their communities without their stamp of approval. Therefore, we had to embark on an advocacy campaign. Therefore, if you need to embark on an advocacy campaign, there should be wider consultations every step of the way with all relevant stakeholders, particularly the groups or communities to be affected positively or negatively by the goals of our advocacy. Secondly, we overcame resistance by local leaders to our campaign approach by explaining our mandate and why it was key to the peace process. We organized town hall meetings, spoke to individual local chiefs, and treated them with respect. After such consultations, they felt confident enough to suggest the best means to disseminate our messages and to recommend trusted individuals or community groups we could work with. This approach created trust between the mission and community leaders. In dealing with demobilized children and young people, including women, we made special provisions for them with the help and advice from UNICEF and NGOs, including issues of sexual education and reproductive health. We engaged UN experts and social welfare specialists and introduced radio programs specifically targeting them. My next point is we must know the fears that make our audience resistant to change and address them. And now here is the crux of the matter. We must address them in a manner that is not condescending but seeks to understand their hopes and fears. We can address this by identifying and correcting misinformation, disinformation, stigma, and discrimination. Another point is we need to speak to people in the language they can understand. If you ever wondered why politicians, for instance, always strive to speak a few words in the language of their audience, it enables them to connect. In UNAMSIL, we used local languages in virtually all our means of communication. We utilize Radio UNAMSIL to the fullest extent possible. And finally, we must use the medium of communication that's convenient to specific communities, both traditional and social media. However, we should be aware of the benefits and dangers of each approach. Radio is the most common means of communication in Africa. Even in other parts of the world, many people are going back to listening to radio. No wonder why podcasts are back in vogue. We should make the greatest use of community radio stations that broadcast in local languages as much as possible. Why? Because community radio stations have their eyes and ears not only on the challenges their communities face, but also the solutions. And as the saying goes, all politics is local. We should get local UN staff to go on radio and talk about the issues we are advocating. Let me stop here. Thank you very much. And over to you, Natascha.
Okay, thank you very much, Masimba. Wow, what a powerful example. And I think what I liked is that a lot of the elements that you've just mentioned, even though it was many years ago, really fit very nicely into what we heard also from colleagues this morning on, building an advocacy strategy. So we heard from you also identifying the different kinds of channels that can be used, whether it's radio, whether it's theatre, concerts, working also with influencers, and you also highlighted the importance of power mapping, identifying who was opposed, who was maybe supportive of the different DR demobilization approaches, and how to also overcome some of the obstacles. So very, very interesting example. Thanks. And I'm sure there might be questions afterwards. So now we come to our final panelist, Danilo. Danilo is currently the Communications and Advocacy Specialist working with the Resident Coordinator's Office in Costa Rica. And Danilo, today you're going to present to us a good example of how in the fight against hate speech and discrimination in Costa Rica, the UN has actually positioned itself to achieve significant results. So I understand that you'll be sharing with us also some of the data impacts and lessons learned, and how you were able also to bring colleagues and key stakeholders together in the fight against hate speech and discrimination. Over to you, Danilo.
Thank you very much, Natascha, colleagues. Let me please share a small presentation I have here for you. And please, just a minute. Okay. Do you see the presentation, colleagues?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much first for this opportunity. A lot of lessons, of course, but first let me tell you that what is happening here in Costa Rica and how the UN and the UNCG led this advocacy and communication strategy that really marked a milestone in the country. I will tell you this experience on hate speech, discrimination, and Afro-descendant population. Okay, colleagues, when someone mentions Costa Rica, this is probably what you think. Beaches, biodiversity, turtles, mountains, volcanoes, and surfing. Carolina knows it because she was here last year. Right, Carolina? Okay, and of course, a country known for its respect to human rights and democracy. But the question here is it really that good and the pura vida equal for everyone in the country? In the 2018 presidential election, we saw a different face in the country. We perceived messages, expressions of violence and discrimination against certain groups. Did we have any data or evidence beyond observations in social media? Really no. So the first step here was finding that evidence. That is how we started producing some very new and innovative investigations using artificial intelligence. What did we find? Okay, first, in 2021, the UN found the existence of more than 500,000 messages containing hate speech in Costa Rican social media, Facebook and Twitter. And in 2022, a 70% growth of these speeches, getting to almost 1 million messages. We had so many findings, but let me tell you just some of them. The political campaign was a trigger of violent messages. Men from all over the country, but especially from the urban areas and from 24 to 45 years, were the main promoters of these speeches. Many targets also: migrants, women, LGBTI populations, journalists, ethnic groups, which mean that racism and discrimination had a space in the Costa Rican society. In 2021, we found 68,000 messages mainly against Afro-descendant people. We saw that most of these messages did not have a direct intention to promote, but almost 70% of them promoted discrimination and social violence, justified for traditions, stereotypes, and lack of education and cultural sensitivity in a large proportions of those people who use social networks in the country. We also found that people understood Afro-descendant population as a unique group, almost as a statistic: good soccer players, culture, food, music, but not necessarily as people. Most of the discrimination was unconscious and unintentional. What to do? So to respond with solutions to these findings, the UN led the first national plan against hate speech and discrimination in Costa Rica. And we, as UNCG, we decided to promote specific action to support these affected populations. Okay, with Afro-descendant people, what did we do? Okay, we decided to create a communication strategy that would help us to give them a space to show their own voices. First-person stories. This is how we produced this book. I'm Afro-descendant in Costa Rica, and this is my story. The UNCG produced 15 stories that show that diversity. It was no longer an homogeneous group. There were women, children, young people, elderlies, doctors, construction workers, migrants, small businesswomen, LGBTI population. These stories show us their origins, experiences, advice, and even the fears they face every day. Okay, what did we achieve? Hundreds of downloads of this publication, wide national and international recognition. Also, we got improved alliances with Afro-descendant organizations, and in the latest UN study showed that the speech on ethnic issues dropped 50% by 2022. The lessons learned. What did we as UNCG learn? Okay, first, we, the UN system, working together, are much stronger and can have a greater impact on these populations. Also, that when agencies are involved from the beginning, they become much more empowered in the process and in the outcomes. We also found that data production is key, to ensure evidence-based decision-making. In performance communications, what cannot be measured really does not exist. So it was, I think, one of our greatest findings. We also learned that we cannot do everything by ourselves. We need strategic partners outside the UN system. So this is how, in alliance with the University of Costa Rica, we were able to produce these stories, the same stories for radio, and have them broadcast in local stations. We also produce a national campaign with the National Chamber of Radio that was broadcast in 75 stations in the whole country, reaching weekly more than 500,000 people. And finally, but not less important, we found that everyone has a story and lessons, experiences that can be useful to someone else. Giving people a voice, is a great opportunity for inclusion and human rights advocacy. Is Costa Rica different now? Yes, we think yes. The country is more aware of the existence of hate speech and discrimination. This is not a myth anymore. Politicians, media, young leaders, activists, and organizations now recognize the need to take urgent actions against hate speech. And just to finish, I want to say that there is, a long way ahead, but we have taken the first steps in this process, and we are very committed to stop hate speech and discrimination in the country. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Danilo. Again, another powerful example. And I think the key takeaways from what you just described are also doing some very thorough research and analysis at the beginning to understand, as we saw before in the theoretical presentation also, what do people believe? What are their perceptions? And then what needs to change in order to eliminate hate speech and discrimination? So looking forward to hearing again, maybe in a couple of months, of the outcomes of that strategy. So now we've heard from global level, we've heard from Africa, we've heard from Latin America, a couple of examples. I know we're running short on time, so maybe back to Celine to manage the plenary discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Natascha, and thank you very much for our panel members for this very interesting presentation and sharing their experience. We also asked our colleagues to the survey if they wanted to also share some of their initiatives they were carrying in the countries, and we have a few examples. So thank you so much for colleagues to share with us. I just want to highlight that Alec from the Resident Coordinator Office asked Danilo, how did you measure hate speech? So if you can tell us right before we give the floor to another colleague from Bosnia and Herzegovina who works at the Resident Coordinator Office, Dalila, who also is working on the hate speech initiative and have done a lot of work. So she mentioned that she doesn't have a strategy per se, but they've been doing a lot of actions, and so it will be very interesting to hear also from her. So first of all, maybe we can give the floor to Dalila, and then we'll see if we have other questions related to hate speech to Danilo. Dalila, are you here?
I'm here. Thank you, Celine. Thank you, colleagues. I think both Alexandra and myself, and I think the Western Balkans colleagues who are on the call, were really intrigued by Danilo's presentation because it's very close to what we are trying to do here, and we would be really interested to maybe continue on beyond this webinar conversation with him, with you, Danilo. You're still on the call. On sort of measuring hate speech, because it is something that we are struggling here. As Celine mentioned, we do not have a concrete strategy, advocacy strategy in place, but we are sort of riding the wave out of necessity, increased necessity here when it comes to hate speech. Concretely, our process started with the action plan development. So the process to develop a UNCG action plan for countering hate speech was supported by the Office for the Prevention of Genocide, but it really involved and it served to involve the UNCG together in what is now this working group on hate speech action plan. At its core, it does have the development of comms and strategy and advocacy strategy development. However, the evolving political context sort of pushed us into action before we could even start drafting it. For context, this was the general elections year in the country, and we have seen some disturbing hate speech increased trends even before the official campaigning started. But again, we're struggling with the actual measurements on it with the IE systems and so on, but we see it, proliferated everywhere. So we knew where the hotspots were, we knew where we needed to engage, but we also knew that we needed wider system support for it. So our process ended up involving the UNCT, the UN Comms Group, this merged working group for the action plan, 2 USG offices, and a High Commissioner for Human Rights. And within the office of the UNRC, the Human Rights Unit worked very closely with comms, which is something that I really need to underline because it was very beneficial to the process. To summarize it as briefly as possible, we worked on 3 levels. One was during these 4 high-level UN senior management visits that we had, we strived for a very common unified messaging on these hate speech trends that we were seeing. They were internally coordinated, always emphasizing the no to hate call, the responsibility of the elected political leaders, especially those that we knew are going to run in the elections as well. And crucially, the responsibility of the mandated human rights institutions in the country to act and react. So unified common messaging at all meetings, importantly, all post-meeting tweets was and remains to be one of the key layers. Behind the scenes, we worked with the human rights institutions, and this is maybe the core advocacy point that we had. We have 4 institutions at state level, and including the Central Electoral Committee. And with the networking and the sort of informal advocacy that we did with them, with this also common messaging, produced in-house, led to a signing of a joint pledge with these 4 institutions to combat hate speech in the elections period and beyond. And it was also accompanied by a joint fact sheet on hate speech, which also outlines the ways to spot it, to report it. And this was consulted and harmonized with all the 4 institutions, and it is mirrored on our UN Bosnia and Herzegovina website as well as their websites. And then the 3rd layer around it all, the external communication, and this is where we sort of merge advocacy with external communication. We did brief social media campaigns around all these advocacy actions, such as the pledge signing, as well as used all the relevant events that we had in the lead up to the elections, where we identified human rights defenders and activists and recorded their short no to hate video messages, which we then continued on using and reusing. So we filed all of this because I know that the Western Balkans colleagues and Alexandra from Serbia is here as well. We used all these actions under our sub-regional comms campaign, which we simultaneously did across Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Montenegro, where we jointly localized the no to hate global assets, and we rolled them out in coordination as the hate speech issues and challenges are the same in all our 3 countries. And I think I speak for all of us or all 3 of our countries when I say that we hope to expand our advocacy efforts into a sub-regional endeavor to make it stronger and more impactful. I know that we are super tight on time and on schedule, so I will stop here, and then if any colleagues are interested, I can always share more and share how our fact sheet look like, how the pledge looks like, and how we sort of tied everything under the no to hate.
Thank you very much, Dalila. That was very interesting. And actually, yes, we only have like 4 minutes left. So we had few more examples. Maybe we can take one more and then we're going to have the closing session. So we want to hear maybe from Pavithra from Tajikistan, who also has conducted a major advocacy effort related to gender equality. So we know that in a few weeks from now, we're going to start the 16 days of advocacy activism. So we want to hear also from Pavithra all the efforts that's been doing, and also to bring to work with colleagues around these joint efforts. So Pavithra, are you here? Are you online?
Yes, hi, I'm here, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, great. Hello, colleagues. Hi, I will briefly tell about our experience of combining all major gender equality promotion related campaigns under one umbrella. It is our experience which we started this year. Usually we have up to 4 or 5 campaigns annually on different aspects of gender equality, starting from International Women's Day to 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. And last year we already had a very big campaign dedicated to 16 Days of Activism because it was 30th anniversary of this worldwide campaign. And also we had the launch of a Spotlight Initiative, a joint program in Tajikistan. And there we engaged about 50 organizations of all types in countrywide and covered almost 500,000 of Tajikistanis. This year with International Women's Day, which was in priority list of UN Communication Group, we decided to combine major gender equality promotion campaigns, as I already mentioned, under one umbrella, and we'll start it on 8th of March and have it year-long by 10th of December when 16 Days of Activism finalizes. So we had key messages for this entire campaign. We had joint concept note and also matrix of events and visuals. And by now we see that it's a very good method to coordinate, and we have more than 30 organizations participating, including UN and extended gender theme group, which includes international agencies, donor agencies, and also embassies, of course, governments, CSOs, and media. And also key activities related to this area within joint programs, Spotlight Initiative and Migration and PTF are also incorporated. And we will use the outcomes of this campaign for future advocacy and reporting. And this campaign is coordinated by Gender Team Group and UN Communication Group. This year's areas of focus were facilitate dialogue and action and promote changes in attitudes. And also based on 2021 gender swap recommendations, we also were focusing on promoting non-traditional gender roles. It was our first try. Next year, we will be thinking more all together, and we will pack everything even better, because next year will be first year of ABA UN SDCF 2023, and that's why I think that it's a good try. I think we can see how this experience could be used in, or if you have any feedbacks, I can put everything together and share, because it was at least very exciting for many agents. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Yes, please share with us. And I'm sorry for other colleagues who were also willing to share their experience from Uganda, from Serbia. Maybe we can share also in writing what they were going to speak about. So I'm just going to give back the floor to Carolina and Janos. Thank you so much to colleagues and UNICEF to be with us today. It was really a pleasure to learn more about advocacy, and we hope that we can have another session altogether to go in depth in all the different strategies. So thank you also to colleagues.
Thank you so much, Celine. I think we need another session on hate speech. I think it's I think there's really a lot of appetite on that, and ever so important. And there were a few questions. Maybe Danilo can answer on the chat what AI tool you used. And if the colleagues can also answer, we've discussed it when we were discussing the comm strategy. We all agreed that a comm strategy without a budget is a little more than a piece of paper. I'm supposing, no one ever talked about funding here, but I'm supposing the same would apply. You need a little bit of a push with the advocacy strategies as well, right? So I think this is just 1.0. Can I suggest a speech that we'll do the 2.0 next year together? Because I think this was really excellent. And I really want to invite the RCO team leaders also to join, because so much of it, like Pavithra said, is really integrated. It really needs to go hand in hand with the cooperation frameworks, because think of the outcomes of the outputs. we're talking the same thing, right? So it's to invite the program folks to be part of this conversation. So excellent. I cannot thank you enough, UNICEF colleagues. So much work and so much effort was put in to make this happen. So thank you to everybody. Extraordinary presentation. Thank you to all the colleagues who shared. Janos, your last word.
Sure, I I will just go in full circle. And I just, well, first of all, huge thanks to everybody. And by the way, Danilo, just for you to say, know that when I hear Costa Rica, I think of you first, and then all the other things, trust me. So, but just Pavithra, I must, stress again that your presentation actually was an excellent sort of proof that there is a science, meaning there's a wealth of knowledge that goes into all. No, that's it. I mean, if we mean science by the fact that you do an experiment, you put in this and this, and the same thing comes up. No, obviously that's not what we're talking about. But science meaning a wealth of experience, a lot of things. But of course, I know that then Sonia wouldn't be able to use Sun Tzu's book. And here we go in my little. There it is. See, it's called The Art of War and not The Art and Science of War. But the point is really a lot of things went into it. What I also enjoyed, Pavithra, and that's to everybody else, is Pavitra's enthusiasm. Please note, you can only do advocacy if you yourself believe in this and are able to do it with all the various different elements that Pavithra mentioned. And by the way, what stuck with me, of course, needless to say, is the point that you made about the hairdresser. Now, my hairdresser is my wife. So if you get her on board, you'll get me on board. But more, look, honestly, more seriously, colleagues, if you listen to all of this attentively, then yes, it may have seemed and looked as if what Pavithra mentioned in all those, sort of elements as a little bit overwhelming. It's not. It's something to think about. It doesn't make advocacy difficult because the various examples showed that it is doable, possible with various different things. Yes, Carolina's right. You do need money, you do need the logistics, etc. And I'm not going to necessarily go to where the military historians go and say that, amateurs talk about strategy and professionals talk about logistics. That you have probably also heard. But the point is, it may seem complicated. It's not necessarily. The things that Pavithra mentioned with the colleagues are the various things that need to be taken into consideration. There's only one thing I would say, and that might be something we can continue discussing, is that probably where we have a challenge nowadays is that unfortunately, with a proliferation of misinformation, disinformation, you get into a situation where when you're doing advocacy, you will also run into deliberate counter advocacy, which is probably a new thing that we will need to face. And I don't know how much UNICEF goes into that, but it's probably something to also keep in mind. But hugely entertaining, very, thought-provoking. No. I mean that. It was a captivating presentation. And as I said, in spite of all the complexity, you guys still made it look easy, and that's also thanks to the colleagues. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and would love to have the 2.0 as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Goodbye, colleagues. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.